She's raising his brother's son alone. He shows up to take the child. What he doesn't know, his brother's dying wish was to keep him away. What she doesn't know, she's the only person who's ever made him want to stay. The town of Weybourne woke early on the 14th of October, as market towns do, with the smell of mud and livestock and bread from the baker on Cloth Street, and had no particular reason to expect a duke. He arrived at 8:30 on a grey horse, attended by a single manservant, which was either admirable restraint or a deliberate understatement, the kind a man employs when he wishes to appear unimpressed before he has confirmed there is anything worth impressing. The horse was excellent. The man's coat was plain and very well cut. The inn on Market Square had one decent room, and he took it without inquiring after the price, which told the innkeeper everything he needed to know, and which the innkeeper's wife relayed to 4 separate households before 10 o'clock. Julian Vane, 6th Duke of Carmoor and Baron Stern, had not been to Weybourne before. He had not needed to be. Weybourne was the sort of place one passed through on the way to somewhere else, a town of solicitors and drapers and a lending library with ambitions above its collection, and it had nothing to recommend it, except that his brother's widow lived here, in a townhouse on Parade Street, raising his brother's son in provincial obscurity. Ned was Julian's heir presumptive. He was 4 years old and had, to Julian's knowledge, never been north of Wiltshire. Julian had Sylvia's letters, brief, correct, and entirely uninformative. Ned is well, we are comfortable. I hope Carmoor is in good order, as though he were a distant relation to be managed with a quarterly note, as though she were not in possession of the only person who stood between the Vane title and a succession crisis. He did not send a card ahead. He rode to Parade Street, handed his horse to a boy outside a chandler's shop and knocked. The housekeeper who answered was a woman of approximately 60, with the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit and had decided views about it. She took his card, read it, and told him Mrs. Vane was not at home. "Her light is in the window," Julian said. The housekeeper looked at him with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that the correct response to a duke is a mild stare. "If your grace would care to wait in the sitting-room." He waited 8 minutes. He counted them against the mantel clock, the good piece French older than the marriage, and inspected the room. Small, well-kept, a child's wooden block under the settle, books stacked beside the armchair rather than shelved, which meant they were being read. Cut chrysanthemums in a blue vase, 3 days old, not yet discarded. He heard her on the stairs before he saw her. She was not hurrying. Sylvia Vane came through the door with the calm of someone who had decided exactly how this morning would go. She was younger than he had pictured. 25, he knew, but she wore it without consciousness. Dark hair, pale skin, a dress that was perfectly appropriate and perfectly plain. Her eyes met his and held no apprehension, no deference, no calculation. She looked at him the way one looks at a problem one has been expecting. "Your Grace," she said, "I would have offered you better welcome had you written first." "I prefer directness," he said. "So I observe." She moved to the table by the window and poured herself tea from a pot already there. "May I offer you some?" "No." She sat. She did not gesture him into a chair. He sat anyway, because remaining standing would have been theatrical. "I am here about Ned," he said. "I supposed you might be." She stirred her tea and set down the spoon. "He is 4, in excellent health, and presently in the garden terrorizing the cat. Is there a specific aspect of his welfare you wish to address?" "His welfare is precisely the point. He is my heir presumptive, the heir to this dukedom and the Stern title, should I die without legitimate issue. He has no connection to the estate or its tenants, no preparation for the position he may one day hold, no male guidance whatsoever. This is not a welfare I find adequate." "I see." She lifted her cup. "And what would you propose instead?" He told her. He had prepared this as one prepares a legal argument, organized, complete, anticipating objection. Ned would come to Carmoor, a tutor within the year. Introduction to the estate gradually and properly. Sylvia would be consulted on matters of education. She would be welcome to visit. Sylvia listened without moving. When he finished, she said, "No." Julian waited for more. There was no more. "I beg your pardon?" he said. "No." She set down her cup. "Ned is 4. He has recently lost his father. He lives in a home where he is known and loved, and I will not remove him from it because you have decided his current arrangements are insufficient." A pause. "With respect." "The respect is noted, as is the refusal. I am the boy's nearest male relation and the head of this family." "You are his uncle," Sylvia said. "His father's will appointed me his guardian. I have the document if you wish to see it." "I have seen the document." Then you know that Robert's testamentary appointment cannot be set aside without evidence of moral failing or criminal conduct on my part. I am afraid I have none to offer you." She said this without sarcasm, simply as information. "If you wish to challenge the will, you may petition the Court of Chancery. Your solicitor will advise you on your prospects." Julian looked at her. He had expected many things from this conversation. He had not expected to be quietly shown the limits of his own legal position before the tea had gone cold. "You have already taken counsel," he said. "When Robert died," she said, "I thought it prudent." The room was quiet. Outside, the cat made its views known. "My concern," he said with deliberate care, "is not the legal document. My concern is that Ned is my heir presumptive, and if I were to die tomorrow, he would inherit everything, the dukedom, the Stern title, 2,000 acres in Dorset, having never set foot on any of it. He does not know the land, he does not know the tenants, he does not know me. That is not adequate preparation for the position he may hold." Something shifted in her expression. Not agreement, but the recognition that he had said something worth hearing. "I am not opposed to Ned knowing you," she said, more carefully. "I am opposed to Ned being removed from his home at 4 years old. Those are different objections." "Yes," she said, "they are." The door opened. A small boy in a blue coat came through it at speed, skidded on the rug, recovered with the ease of long practice, and stopped when he saw Julian. His eyes, pale brown, wide-set, unmistakably Robert's, went directly to the stranger. He had a wooden horse in his hand, small, rough-cut, clearly made by someone with a penknife and patience rather than any professional skill. The ears were uneven. The tail was a knot of actual string. Ned considered Julian for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and held out the horse. Julian looked at the horse. He looked at the child. He did not take it. Ned waited, then lowered the horse without visible offense and turned to his mother. "The cat went under the gate. Mrs. Hooper says it isn't coming back." "I think it will," Sylvia said. "This is your Uncle Julian. Can you say good morning?" Ned examined Julian with the frank assessment of the very young. "Good morning," he said, satisfied, and went back the way he had come. Julian looked at the empty doorway. "He has Robert's eyes." "Yes," Sylvia said. Her voice was level. "He does." Julian stood. "I will call again, Mrs. Vane." "As you like." She rose, which indicated the visit was concluded, and she had determined when. "I will tell Mrs. Hooper to offer your man tea." He left. On the street he stood in the October air for a moment, market noise rising around him, and found he had no idea what he had expected from this visit. Not that. Not any of it. He went back to the inn and told his man to unpack properly. He called the following morning with Paris, a solicitor from Bath who had ridden up and was clearly regretting it. Sylvia received them in the same sitting room. She had her own letter ready on the table. Paris laid out the grounds for ducal involvement, guardianship oversight, the heir presumptive's education and preparation, the management of the Dorset estate correspondence which had, apparently, been redirected to Mrs. Vane by some informal arrangement that had no legal basis Julian could identify. Sylvia listened. When Paris finished, she slid her letter across the table. It was from a London solicitor. It was thorough. "Your informal arrangement," Julian said, "regarding the Dorset estate's correspondence." "Robert asked the steward to copy me on reports," she said. "I found it useful to understand the estate's condition as Ned's guardian. I have made no decisions. I have simply kept informed." A pause. "The steward found it equally useful to have someone respond to his queries, as you were not in the habit of responding promptly." Julian said nothing. This was accurate, and he knew it. "I am not attempting to administer the estate," she said. "I am attempting to understand it, so that when Ned is old enough to understand it himself, there is someone to explain it to him." She looked at Julian steadily. "You could, of course, simply write to the steward yourself." Paris looked between them with the expression of a man watching something above his pay. "The matter of Ned's preparation," Julian said, setting the estate question aside with the precision of a man who has lost a point and will not acknowledge it, "remains." "It does," she agreed, "and I'm not unwilling to discuss it. I'm unwilling to discuss it through solicitors." She looked at him directly. "If you wish to speak about Ned's future, his education, his connection to the estate, his knowing the family he may one day represent, speak to me. Directly. I am here every morning." Julian looked at her for a long moment. Then he dismissed Paris. He called the next morning without Paris. Sylvia received him. Tea appeared. He asked about Ned's current arrangements, what the child could read, whether he had a tutor, what he did with his days. She answered without defensiveness, giving him exactly what he asked for, and nothing more. He asked a second question, then a third. She answered those too. He was trying to find the gap in her, the thing she was hiding or failing at or had missed. He did not find it. "You have thought about this," he said. More observation than compliment. "For 18 months, she said. It was the primary thing I had to think about." He looked at the room, the books within reach, the child's drawings on a small table near the window, stacked with apparent order, the blue vase of chrysanthemums which had been replaced since his first visit. He had assumed this household was improvised. It was not. It was careful. "Robert's letters to me stopped 3 years ago," he said. "I know," she said. "Did he tell you why?" She was quiet for a moment. "He told me that you had both been wrong about something, and that neither of you had said so, and that the longer it went unaddressed, the more impossible it became to address." She paused. "He said it was his fault, as much as yours." "It was," Julian said, which was more than he had said about it to anyone. She looked at him with something that was not sympathy. She was not a woman given to sympathy as a performance, but was clear and considered. "He thought you would come eventually," she said. "He was not wrong." Julian looked at the fire. "He should have written." "Yes," she said simply, without softening it. He stayed another half hour and learned nothing against her, and went back to the inn. Market day in Weybourne was a Thursday, and on the third Thursday of Julian's stay, he made the mistake of being on Cloth Street at 10:30. Sylvia saw him first. She did not change direction. He fell into step beside her because retreat would have generated more talk than proximity, and Weybourne was already talking. "Your Grace," she said, "do you shop at markets?" "I was walking." In the direction of the cheese stall, an understandable destination. Ned, who had been examining tin soldiers, became aware of Julian and abandoned them immediately. "You came," he said, as though this had been arranged. "I was passing," Julian said. Ned accepted this and took Julian's hand, with the same absolute quality he always had, small, complete, requiring no consent. They processed through the market in this configuration, Sylvia on Julian's left, Ned on his right, Mrs. Hooper behind, and Julian had the distinct sensation of having arrived somewhere he had not planned to be. "He does this with people he likes," Sylvia said, not quite under her breath. "He has known me 2 weeks," Julian said. "He liked you at the introduction. I couldn't tell you why." She paused at a stall of preserves and examined a jar of quince. "You didn't take the horse." Julian looked at her. "When?" "The first morning he offered you bramble. You didn't take it." "He offers it to strangers?" "He has never offered it to anyone." She set down the quince. "Bramble was his father's. He doesn't share it." Julian had no answer. Sylvia did not require one. At the end of Cloth Street, Ned produced bramble from his coat pocket. He had had it all along and held it up. "This is bramble," he said formally. "He likes apples. Do you have an apple?" "I don't," Julian said. Ned was untroubled. "Tomorrow you could bring one." "Ned," Sylvia said. "He could," Ned said reasonably and pocketed bramble. Julian looked at Sylvia. She was looking at the street ahead, but something at the corner of her mouth was not quite becoming a smile. "Shall I bring an apple?" Julian said. "I leave that to your Grace's discretion," she said, and walked on. He brought an apple the following morning. Ned presented bramble for the transaction, explained the horse's dietary preferences at length, and ate the apple himself on Bramble's behalf. Julian sat in the armchair by the fire and watched this ceremony with the feeling of a man who has wandered considerably from where he intended to be and has not, precisely minded. Sylvia, from the settee, watched both of them with the expression she wore when she was thinking something she had not decided to say. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into Julian's stay. It was from Graves, his London solicitor, and its contents were straightforward and unwelcome. Philip Forsyth, Sylvia's second cousin, a fact Julian had not previously had cause to consider, had filed a petition in Chancery regarding Ned's guardianship. Graves was candid about its merits, thin, he wrote, and without strong precedent. Heir maternal second cousin had essentially no standing to challenge a testamentary appointment, particularly with the paternal uncle, the head of the boy's own family, already present and engaged. The petition would almost certainly be dismissed, but it would take time and create disruption. More pressingly, Forsyth had apparently been making inquiries about the Dorset estate with at least one local solicitor, which suggested his interest was not purely in the child's welfare. Julian went to Parade Street at 11. Sylvia was at her writing desk. She looked up with the expression that had become familiar, not unwelcoming but prepared. She had learned in 3 weeks not to be entirely off guard. He told her about Forsyth. He watched her face as he laid it out. "Philip," she said, not surprised, something more like the confirmation of a suspicion. "You expected this?" He visited in the spring. He was very attentive to Ned and very interested in the Dorset acreage. She set down her pen. "I did not think he would act on it." Julian looked at her. "The petition will not succeed. Graves is clear on that, but it will be disruptive, and if Forsyth has a solicitor examining the estate—" "He wants to be named co-guardian," Sylvia said. "Not for Ned, for access to the correspondence." "Yes," Julian said. "That is my reading also." "Then we should be in agreement before the Chancery Examiner asks." She folded her hands. "You and I, the boy's mother, and the head of his paternal family." She looked at him directly. "Whatever our private disagreements, Forsyth should not benefit from them." Julian held her gaze. "That is exactly my proposal." "I know," she said. "Sit down. We had better go through Robert's papers." He sat. She moved to the shelf for a box of correspondence. They worked side by side in the afternoon light, her handwriting and his on the same sheet, her hand once reaching across him for a document he was still reading, a half-apologized movement that he answered by giving her room. The fire was low. Mrs. Hooper brought tea without being asked. Julian had not been this comfortable in months. He did not examine this closely. There was, Julian discovered, a further complication he had not anticipated. Graves raised it in a second letter the following week, with the careful neutrality of a solicitor conveying information of some delicacy. The matter was this. Julian was 32 years old, unmarried and in good health. Ned's position as heir presumptive was real, but not guaranteed. If Julian were to marry and produce a legitimate son, Ned would be displaced entirely, from the dukedom, from the barony, from the Dorset lands. He would be left with nothing but his mother's portion and whatever goodwill the family chose to extend. Graves did not need to point out that Sylvia understood this. She was an intelligent woman, with a capable solicitor of her own. She had always known that Ned's prospects depended not on legal right, but on the goodwill of the man she was currently fighting. Julian sat with this for some time. He went to Parade Street that afternoon. Sylvia was in the sitting room. He closed the door, which he had not done before, and sat in the chair opposite. "You know," he said without preamble, "that if I marry, Ned loses everything." "Yes," she said evenly. "You have always known it." "From the day Robert died," she said. "My solicitor was not subtle about it." Julian looked at her. "And yet you have not." He stopped. He had been about to say "used it," which was not the right word, except it was the word he would have used 3 weeks ago, and he was no longer certain it was wrong. "You haven't pressed it," he said, "as a point of leverage." "It is not leverage," she said. "It is simply true. You might marry tomorrow and there is nothing I could do about it." She met his eyes. "I have preferred to proceed on the assumption that you are a man of decent character who, once he understood the situation, would act accordingly. It seemed more practical than antagonism." Julian said nothing for a moment. "Was I wrong?" she said. "No," he said, more quickly than he had intended. She nodded once and looked back at the papers. "Then I don't think we need to discuss it further." He stayed 3 hours that afternoon and left when the light was gone. Robert's papers were a monument to cheerful disorder. He had filed things by some internal logic that made sense only to himself. Letters grouped by mood rather than sender, receipts tucked into books, estate documents folded into personal correspondence, as though both were of equal importance, which for Robert they probably had been. Julian sorted. Sylvia knew where things actually were, and retrieved them when Julian had been through a category twice. "He was not systematic," Julian said. "He was systematic," Sylvia said. "Just not in ways that transfer." She said it without sentimentality. Julian had learned in 3 weeks that she spoke about Robert with accuracy, not performance, that she did not paper over him with grief or reverence. She said what was true, that he was disorganized and generous, better with people than with paperwork, liable to promise things and leave others to fulfill them. She said this the way one states facts about the weather. Julian, who had spent 18 months constructing an idea of Robert composed mostly of suspicion and loss, found this uncomfortable. "He never wrote to tell me about the marriage," Julian said. "No. I heard from the solicitor. That was not my arrangement. I would have written to you myself had Robert wished it." Julian set down the letter he was holding. "And he did not wish it." She was quiet for a moment. He was complicated about you, she said. You know that. We had a disagreement. Yes. Her tone accepted the word without endorsing it. What did he tell you about it? She considered him. He said you had both been wrong and both too proud to say so, and the longer it went unaddressed, the more impossible it became. He said it was his fault as much as yours. A pause. He also said that you would come eventually. He thought you would come for Ned. He thought I would come. He knew you, she said, better than you believed he did. Julian looked at the papers between them and felt the discomfort of a man being told something accurate about himself by someone with no reason to be accurate and every reason not to be. He should have written, Julian said. Yes, she said, and you should have written to him. He didn't argue. He went back to the papers. The meeting with Forsyth's representative was on a Friday in Price's offices. Price was a steady man who had handled Robert's estate and regarded Julian with careful respect and Sylvia with visible trust. Forsyth's man was from London, sharper than Price, and arrived with the air of someone who had come a long way and intended to make it worthwhile. He was polite to Julian, and barely civil to Sylvia, which Julian noted. The petition was laid out. Forsyth's claim was precisely what Graves had described, co-guardianship, framed as additional provision for the child's interests, with language that implied Sylvia's management was adequate but incomplete. There was nothing in it that bore legal examination, but it was legible enough as an argument that dismissing it required the effort of addressing it. Julian addressed it. When the representative pushed on questions of Ned's education and estate preparation, Julian deferred to Sylvia, turned to her, let her answer, did not speak over her when she corrected a misapprehension. The second time he did this, Forsyth's man paused. He had arrived expecting opposition between a duke and a widow. He had found something different, and he knew what it meant. He left without having achieved anything. Outside, Price allowed himself a small satisfied expression. Julian and Sylvia walked half a block before she said, "You deferred to me." "You were correct." "You knew I was correct before the meeting." "Yes." She glanced at him. "Thank you." "It was practical," he said. "It was also something else," she said without pressing it, and turned toward Parade Street. The evenings were the thing Julian had not anticipated. He had imagined Weybourne as a surgical exercise. He had not imagined that October would become November, and the nights would close in early, and the inn's parlour would be inadequate, and Sylvia's sitting room would have a fire that was always well maintained. He had not imagined that the conversation would not end when the legal matter was set aside. They talked about Robert some evenings, not at length but in pieces, a detail here, a story there, and the picture that emerged was more complete than either had been carrying alone. "He didn't tell me he was ill," Julian said one evening without preamble. Sylvia set down her letter. "He didn't want you to come for that reason. He didn't want me to come at all." She didn't deny it. "He was afraid you would arrive intending to put things right, and he would die before either of you managed to say anything that mattered." Julian looked at the fire. "He loved you," she said. "He spoke of you often, not always easily, but often. You were present in this house long before you arrived in it." "I should have come sooner." "Yes," she said, simply without the cushion. He looked at her. He had expected more comfort than that. Something truer in him was glad not to receive it. He stayed until 9 o'clock, which was longer than he had intended, and walked back to the inn with the feeling of something shifting in him at a rate he could not entirely manage. Ned had opinions about Julian. He had recently discovered opinions as a tool and wielded them without restraint, but his opinions about Julian were particular. He had decided on some internal basis that resisted examination that Julian was interesting. He showed Julian things, a stone, a leaf, the pattern firelight made on the ceiling, with the confidence of someone sharing important information, and he brought Bramble into Julian's vicinity with increasing frequency. On a Tuesday in early November, Sylvia asked Julian, with the air of conducting an experiment she did not wish to name, if he might take Ned for a walk while she dealt with correspondence. Julian said yes before considering the mechanics. Ned presented himself in the hall in his coat and hat, Bramble already in his pocket, and regarded Julian with the bright expectation of someone whose arrangements have gone exactly as planned. The river path was quiet. Ned walked with the sideways intermittent progress of a small child, stopping to examine things Julian would have passed. A stone, dock leaves, 2 branches crossed in a shape apparently requiring consideration. Julian waited at each stop. He was surprised to find he did not want to hurry him. "That man who came to the house," Ned said, of Forsyth's representative, apparently still processing this, He didn't like Mama. He was here on business, Julian said. He kept looking at her like this. Ned produced an expression of dismissal with more accuracy than Julian would have expected. You look at her differently. Julian considered the river. Do I? Yes. Ned produced Bramble and held the horse toward the water. How come you didn't come before? I didn't know I should. Papa talked about you, Ned said. He said you had the same hands. Julian looked at his hands. What did he mean? I don't know. He said it when I made something. Ned pocketed Bramble and looked up with Robert's eyes. Do you make things? I used to. You should make Bramble a stable, Ned said with the breezy confidence of someone issuing a commission. Bramble hasn't got a stable. He then moved off to examine a piece of bark, leaving Julian by the river with an assignment from a source he had not anticipated. They sat on the bench near the churchyard. Ned set Bramble on Julian's knee without asking, the way one places a thing where it belongs, and looked at the water. Julian sat with the small wooden horse on his knee, the uneven ears, the string tail, the grain running wrong at the neck because Robert hadn't known or hadn't cared, and felt something in his chest for which he did not have a word. Sylvia was at the window when they returned. She stepped back when she saw Julian look up, not quite quickly enough. He filed this away. She was reading when he arrived that Thursday evening. She finished the page before she looked up, which he had stopped being surprised by. She offered sherry. He accepted it. They talked about Robert, obliquely, carefully, both navigating around the falling out without naming it. She said something small and true about Robert that Julian did not know, something about the way he listened to people without seeming to, and Julian went quiet. He thought you'd disagree, she said. She had Cowper's poems open in her lap, Robert's copy apparently, the margins full of his handwriting. She turned to a page and read 4 lines about habit and the paths men make themselves, then said, He wrote in the margin, Jay would disagree with this. May I? She brought the book. She was standing beside his chair for a moment, both of them looking at Robert's handwriting in the margin, small, slanted, exactly as Julian remembered from letters that had stopped 3 years ago. The lamp behind her put her face in partial shadow. He knew me, Julian said. He paid attention, she said, to everyone. She went back to the settee. It was one of the things. He stayed until 9:30. At the door he paused, as he had begun to do, with the sense that something else wanted to be said, and the knowledge that he did not yet have the language for it. Good night, Mrs. Vane, he said. Good night, Your Grace, she said, without looking up from Cowper. He did not go to Parade Street for 2 days. On the 3rd morning he was on Cloth Street, and found himself outside the baker's shop, looking at the small red-painted horse in the window, the kind sold at market fairs, nothing like Bramble, and accepted that something had happened to him and had been happening for some time. He bought a loaf he didn't need and went back to the inn and got his penknife from his travelling case, where it had been since Carmoor. He went to the carpenter near the market and purchased a small plank of lime wood. He worked that evening. His hands knew what to do. He and Robert had learned from their father, one of the only unserious things their father had ever permitted himself, the two of them in the estate carpenter's shop on winter afternoons, learning to read the grain. Robert had never got the grain right. Julian always had. He went to Parade Street the following morning with a small wooden stable in his hand. Mrs. Hooper opened the door, looked at the stable, and concealed what she thought about it with professional competence. She showed him in. Sylvia was in the sitting room. She looked at the stable and was quiet for a moment. It needs a horse, Julian said. She stood and crossed to him. She examined the roof, the stall proportions, the carved lintel above the door. She looked at it for long enough that he understood she was seeing more in it than carpentry. Then she looked up at him. You made this, she said. I had time, he said. She looked at it once more. Ned will... She stopped. Julian. He met her eyes. I wrote a letter to my mother, she said. I didn't send it. I described the situation. A pause. I described you. And? I was not unkind, she said. He held her gaze. May I ask what you said? No, she said, not yet. She looked back at the stable, but I think... She stopped. Then, in the voice of someone arriving at a decision they have been approaching for a long time, I am glad you came, despite everything. He had 12 possible responses, and chose none of them. He simply looked at her in the sitting room where he had arrived 43 days ago, with a legal argument and a set of assumptions that had not survived her, and found his face doing something he was not controlling. She looked at him with something that was not composure at all, and then turned away slightly, because it was too much to look at directly. Ned will be down shortly, she said. Good, he said. He sat in his armchair. The stable sat on the table between them, waiting for a horse. November settled into Weybourne, with the determination of a season that knows it has won. The river ran high. Julian's circuit of the town had expanded, a longer river path that added 15 minutes, and which he walked on days when there was too much in his head. He had been in Weybourne 6 weeks. He was aware that this exceeded any resolution the situation required, and he was aware that Weybourne was aware of it too. The innkeeper no longer asked when his Grace anticipated departing. Mrs. Hooper brought Julian tea without being asked, and on one occasion had offered him a biscuit. The chandler's boy had named his horse. The town talked. A neighbour of Sylvia's, a Mrs. Fairweather, called on a Wednesday morning and said so at some length. Julian heard about it that evening, delivered in a tone entirely dry. She approves, Sylvia said. She has strong feelings about the advantages of connection to the Vane family. And what did you say? That his Grace and I were managing a legal matter concerning my son. She looked at the fire. She did not find this convincing. Are you uncomfortable with the talk? Julian asked. I am accustomed to being talked about. I am Robert Vane's widow in a market town. She paused. I am more uncomfortable with the accuracy of some of it. He looked at her. She did not look at him, which was itself informative. The evening ended earlier than usual. She said she had letters to write, which was probably true. He went out into the November cold with the sense that something had been said, and also that nothing had been said, and that the territory between those two states was becoming untenable. On a grey Wednesday, Julian took Ned to the river. It was Sylvia's idea, framed as practical. She had an appointment with Price. But he had the sense she arranged things deliberately. Ned stood at the required distance from the weir and regarded the water with scientific focus. He held Bramble out over the edge, apparently letting the horse look, then drew him back. Bramble doesn't like the water, he said. He told me. They sat on the bank. Ned ate the bread Julian had brought. The weir made its noise. The cold was companionable. Do you live at a big house? Ned asked. Yes, Carmore, it has its own river. Does it have a cat? Stable cats, they're not for holding. Ned considered this. Papa said you had a big house. He said it was very serious. He squinted. What does that mean for a house? Julian thought about Carmore. The closed rooms, the gallery that echoed, the dining room that had not seated a full table since his father's time. It means, he said, that it has forgotten how to be comfortable. Ned nodded. He set Bramble on Julian's knee, the same gesture, the same certainty of placement, and leaned against Julian's arm, looking at the water. Julian looked down at the small wooden horse, the wrong grain at the neck, the stringtail, Robert's hands doing it imperfectly and not caring. Your face is doing that thing, Ned said. What thing? The waiting thing. Ned looked up at him. Like it's waiting for something bad. Is something bad going to happen? No, Julian said. And then, because it was true, not anymore, I think. Ned nodded and ate the apple without further concern. Sylvia was not in the sitting room when they returned. She was at the dining room desk, the afternoon post before her, with the expression of someone who has read something that requires thought. She looked up when Ned descended on her with the full account of the weir. The fish, Bramble's view of the water, Julian's face and what it did by the river. She listened with full attention, her pen loose in her hand, and her expression when Ned said, "He said nothing bad is going to happen anymore," was something Julian could not fully read. Not relief. Something past relief. She pulled Ned close for a moment, and he submitted without complaint, which meant he understood it was needed. Then he was off to the kitchen. Sylvia looked at Julian across the room. "Thank you," she said. "It was a pleasure," he said, and meant it precisely. She looked down at her letters. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the desk, where he had no particular business being. She did not tell him he shouldn't. She wrote. He looked at the fire. The household made its sounds around them. It was the most domestic hour he had spent in years, possibly in his life. He had grown up in a house that was serious and large, and had carried that house with him in all his habits, and sitting in a dining room in Weybourne while a woman he had come to fight wrote her correspondence and her son ate biscuits in the kitchen, was as far from Carmore as he had ever been. He was not sorry to be here. "You have been in Weybourne 6 weeks," Sylvia said without looking up. "Yes." "The legal matter is, practically speaking, resolved." "Practically," he agreed. She set down her pen. She looked at him with a different quality of direct, the look of someone holding something they are afraid to set down. "What happens when it is fully resolved?" she said. When Forsyth retreats, when there is no more business. I don't know, he said, honest and therefore unusual. She nodded. She picked up her pen. She went back to the letter, and Julian sat in the chair beside her desk, and neither of them said anything else, and neither of them pretended it was about the legal matter. He stayed that evening until the fire was low. The conversation moved from practical things to other things, her opinion on Pope, his counter-argument, 20 minutes of the most pleasantly combative exchange he had enjoyed since university. Neither of them conceded the Pope question. Both of them were slightly enjoying themselves. When the clock read 9:15, and neither of them had moved, he looked at her. Across the low fire, Cowper's poems on the settle beside her, where she had put them and not gone back to, and said, "I did not come here expecting you." She was quiet for a moment. "No, I know. I came expecting someone easier to dismiss. I know that too." "I find I cannot," he said. "I have tried in various ways. I cannot." The fire crackled. He stood. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. She looked up at him with the composure that had become, over 6 weeks, the thing he understood was the bravest part of her, built to survive things, and now costing her something different. He was close enough. The moment was entirely present. He stepped back. "Not yet," he said, not only to her. At the threshold, "Good night, Sylvia." "Good night," she said. Her hands, he noticed, were very still in her lap. He stood on Parade Street in the dark and understood, with the clarity of cold air, that he was a man who had spent his life waiting for something bad, and who had, in a sitting room in Wiltshire, started waiting for something else entirely. He did not go to Parade Street for 3 days. On the second day he walked the river path and passed a man with a child on his shoulders, the child laughing, the man holding the child's ankles with the ease of long practice. Julian stopped and watched them go, then stood on the path for a long moment and thought about his father, who had been a serious man in a serious house, and about Robert, who had not cared about any of that, and had made a child and loved him and died, and about what it meant to have been the responsible one all his life, and to have been, under all of it, simply lonely. He went back to the inn. He got his penknife. He had finished the stable. The rider came to him almost without planning, smaller than the horse, a figure barely 3 inches tall, smoothed down until the grain was fine. He worked 2 evenings. Then he went to Parade Street. Sylvia looked at the rider he placed beside the stable. She looked at it for long enough. "Julian," she said. He sat in his armchair. She went back to her correspondence. Ned, arriving from the garden, spotted the rider immediately, picked it up, and held it against Bramble with the reverence of a child who has been given something he did not know he was waiting for. "Did you make it?" Ned asked Julian. "Yes." Ned looked at it. He looked at Julian. "It looks like Papa," he said. The room was quiet. Sylvia set down her pen. She did not look up immediately. When she did, her expression was entirely clear, and she let Julian see it without looking away. "The stable needs to go on the mantelpiece," Ned announced. "That's where it lives." He carried both pieces there with care, positioned them with the seriousness of a curator, and stepped back to examine the result. "Good," he said, and left. Julian looked at the fire. Sylvia looked at her letters. The stable stood on the mantelpiece with the rider beside it, and the rider stood beside the horse, and Bramble faced the room with his uneven ears and his string tail. Nobody moved the stable. Nobody needed to. The stable had migrated to the mantelpiece permanently, as Ned had decreed, and Bramble went in and out of it with the irregularity of a horse with other commitments. Julian noticed, on his next several visits, that the rider had been positioned differently each time, sometimes beside the horse, sometimes on the roof, once inexplicably face down in the straw Ned had sourced from somewhere, and said nothing about it. Forsyth's representative returned on a Thursday. He came with a revised petition, which Price reviewed that morning, and summarized with the careful neutrality of a man conveying news he finds professionally embarrassing on someone else's behalf. Forsyth had narrowed his claim, no longer seeking co-guardianship outright, but requesting chancery oversight of Ned's education and estate preparation, with himself named as a supervising advisor. It was, Price said, an even weaker argument than the first. Chancery would not appoint a maternal second cousin to supervise anything over the active objection of both the child's mother and the head of his paternal family. The petition existed to create inconvenience and to suggest publicly that Sylvia's arrangements required outside scrutiny. "He knows it won't succeed," Sylvia said when Julian relayed this. "He is hoping we will pay him to withdraw it," Julian said. She looked at him. "Will we?" "No," Julian said. She nodded once with the expression of someone whose assessment has been confirmed. "Then we go to the meeting and he goes home." They went to the meeting in Price's offices. Forsyth's man was polite to Julian and barely civil to Sylvia, which Julian had observed before and liked no better for the repetition. The revised petition was presented. Julian and Sylvia dismantled it methodically, Price providing the legal scaffolding, and Julian and Sylvia providing the substance. When the representative pushed on the question of Ned's preparation for his potential future position, Julian said, "Mrs. Vane and I are in complete agreement on the matter," and deferred to her. When the man turned back to Julian as though Sylvia had not spoken, Julian said, "Mrs. Vane has just answered your question. I have nothing to add." The representative left. Price permitted himself a small expression of satisfaction, which for Price was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Outside on the street, Sylvia walked beside Julian in the November cold, half a block. Then, "You did that again?" "It seemed warranted," Julian said. "It was." She glanced at him. "Thank you." "Don't thank me for basic courtesy," he said. "All right," she said. "Then I'll thank you for making it look effortless." The corner of her mouth moved. It clearly wasn't. He looked at her. "It has become easier," he said, which was more than he had intended to say, and she heard the rest of it and did not comment, which was one of the things about her he had stopped being surprised by. They walked back to Parade Street. Mrs. Hooper had tea ready. Ned had constructed something on the sitting room floor, involving every wooden block in the house, and was unwilling to explain its purpose. Julian sat in his armchair, and Sylvia sat on the settee, and they drank their tea, and the afternoon went on around them, ordinary and specific, and Julian thought, "This." He did not say it, but he thought it. It was not the tea that did it, nor the meeting nor the walk. It was an hour later when the relief of the morning had settled, and they were both less careful than usual, and Julian said something he had not planned to say. They were discussing Forsyth, his motives, his retreat, what the withdrawal of the petition would mean, and Julian said with the ease of a man who has been thinking something privately for too long, "He came because he thought you would be easily managed. A widow without male protection, a tenuous position, a child whose prospects depend on the goodwill of the family. It is the obvious avenue for someone who knows how to read a situation." He heard himself stop. Sylvia had set down her cup. She had folded her hands in her lap. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before, not anger, not hurt, but something quieter and more definitive. It was the face of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has, without announcement, simply stopped. She said nothing. Julian heard the sentence again. He heard tenuous position and no male protection, and the obvious avenue, heard the entire architecture of it and what it revealed about the frame he had still been carrying, the frame that placed her as a variable in someone else's problem, rather than as the fixed point around which everything else had been forced to reconfigure. He put down his own cup. "That," he said, "is not what I meant to say." She waited. "What I meant to say," he said carefully, "is that you are not manageable. That Forsyth misjudged you entirely, as I did, and that I understood this considerably earlier than I admitted it." He stopped. "I am still—" Another stop. "I have habits of thought that are not accurate. About you, I am aware of them. I am working on them with imperfect results." The room was quiet. "Julian," she said. She stood. She went to the writing desk, opened the lower drawer, and took out an envelope. She brought it back and placed it on the table between them, on top of the legal papers. She did not tell him to open it. He picked it up. The envelope was worn at the crease, opened and refolded many times. His name was on the front in Robert's hand, slanted, quick, the particular hook on the jadives that Julian had spent 3 years not thinking about. He looked at her. "He wrote it in the last week," she said. "He asked me to keep it, not to send it unless—" She paused. "He said, unless Julian gives you cause. I have spent 7 weeks deciding whether you had." "And?" "I have decided," she said, "that you had cause to receive it. Not because you have behaved badly enough to warrant it, but because I think you need it." Julian opened the letter. 2 pages. Robert's hand looser than he remembered, the pen pressure uneven in the way of someone who is conserving effort. He read it without speaking. The first page was Robert as Julian had always known him, discursive, circling the central thing, making 3 detours before arriving anywhere. He described Ned's laugh. He described the way Sylvia organized a room. He described Waybourne in autumn, the way the light came through the sitting room window at 4 o'clock. the cat that kept coming back under the gate. The second page was something else. I know you will arrive certain of the situation, because you are always certain and nearly always wrong in the specific ways that matter most. She is not what you will think she is. I married her because she was the only person I had ever met who was not afraid of me when I was good and not gentle with me when I was bad. And I was bad about you, Julian, for 3 years, and she would not let me be comfortable in it. So I am writing this instead of having said it. Keep Ned away from you. Not because I don't love you, because you don't know how to love anything back yet. And I don't want him to learn that watching you. I want him to learn it from her. But I think you might learn it from her too, if you stop performing long enough to let her show you. I should have written, I was waiting for you to write first, which you know is what I always said and you know I was right about. We were both idiots. You were the more stubborn one. That is not a point of pride. Tell her I was right about the Pope. Julian sat with the letter for a long moment. The fire had burned lower without either of them noticing. The Pope, he said. We had an argument, Sylvia said. He maintained he was right. He died before it was settled. He says here he was right. He would, she said. He was not. Julian folded the letter along its existing creases. He set it on the table. He was right, Julian said, about the other things. She was quiet. I don't... He stopped. He tried again. I have spent 32 years not developing the language for this, and I need it now, and it is not there. I know, Sylvia said. That is not sufficient. No, she agreed, but it is a beginning. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. He asked you to keep Ned from me. Yes. And I installed myself at the inn anyway. You did, she said. And you let me stay. I could hardly throw out a duke. You could have made it considerably less tolerable. Yes, she said, I could have. She met his eyes without looking away. I did not want to. He held her gaze. The room was very quiet. Why? He said. She looked at her hands, then at him. Because Robert's letter told me you were certain of everything and actually certain of nothing, and I wanted to see what happened when you were wrong enough times. She paused. And because Ned offered you bramble on the first morning, and you didn't take it, and yet you came back. He said nothing. His face was doing something he was not controlling. You should keep the letter, she said. He wrote it to you. He left it with you, Julian said. Keep it. It told me to listen to you. I should like the instruction to remain where it can be applied. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression was very clear and entirely unguarded, and then she composed it again, not to conceal it from him now, he understood, but from long habit. All right, she said. He stood. At the door he turned back. She was at the settee, Robert's letter on the table beside her, one hand resting near it without touching it. He was wrong about the Pope, Julian said. Completely wrong, she said. I intend to win that argument on his behalf, Julian said, at length over several evenings. She looked at him steadily. I expect you'll try, she said. He went out. On Parade Street the cold hit him cleanly, and he walked without thinking and understood with the particular clarity that comes after long confusion that he was a man who had arrived in Weybourne to take something and had, through a process he had not designed and could not have predicted, been given something instead. 3 days. He sent a note on the 1st, brief, practical, asking whether Price needed anything further regarding the Forsyth matter. Sylvia's reply was equally brief and equally practical, which told him nothing except that she had replied promptly, which told him something. He worked on the 2nd day. He went through the Carmore correspondence that had accumulated during his weeks in Weybourne and found his opinions about it had changed. The Eastern tenants' lease, the drainage, the question of the closed East Wing gallery. He wrote 3 letters with more warmth than was strictly necessary and posted them before he could revise them. On the 3rd day he called on Price and asked him to draw up a document. Price listened to the specification. He asked 2 clarifying questions. His face remained professionally composed. Then, you are quite certain, Your Grace? Quite certain, Julian said. Price wrote the document. Julian read it twice, signed it, and went to Parade Street. There was, however, one matter he had not yet addressed, and he had been avoiding it with the deliberate thoroughness of a man who knows he is avoiding something. The heir presumptive question. Graves had raised it weeks ago. Sylvia had addressed it herself in the conversation about Forsyth, with the composed directness she brought to everything difficult. If you marry and have sons, Ned loses everything. I have preferred to proceed on the assumption that you are a man of decent character. She had not pressed it. She had not used it. She had set it down between them like a fact about the weather, and moved on. He had been thinking about it ever since. The document Price had drawn up addressed the guardianship. It formalized Sylvia's position, neutralized Forsyth permanently, made any future challenge substantially more difficult. But it did not address what happened to Ned if Julian married. If Julian had sons, if Ned, at some future point, found himself not heir presumptive but simply a nephew with no legal claim on anything at all. Julian had thought about this for 3 days, with the focus of a man who has been given a problem that has only one honest answer. He went to Parade Street. Sylvia was at the writing desk when Mrs. Hooper showed him in. Not the legal papers this time, but household accounts, the ordinary business of a well-run home. She set them aside without waiting for the end of a column. He noticed this. He set the document on the table. She read it thoroughly. She read the operative clause twice. She set it down. "You have withdrawn the guardianship claim entirely," she said. "Yes." "And Forsyth is addressed in the 3rd paragraph. Price believes it is definitive. I agree." She looked at the document, then at him. "Why?" He had the answer ready. "Because Robert appointed you, he was right to. And because I have been wrong about nearly everything since I arrived, and the things I have done that were wrong should be corrected where they can be corrected." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a very complete answer. I had 3 days." She looked at the document once more, then set it down. "Julian." He met her eyes. "There is something else," she said, "not a question." "Yes," he said. He sat down, which he had not done yet. She waited. "If I marry," he said, "Ned loses his position. You know this." "I have known it from the beginning," she said. "I want to address it." She was very still. "How?" "My man of business is drawing up a separate settlement," Julian said. "Independent of the entail, independent of the succession, a provision for Ned that holds regardless of what happens to his position as my heir, whether I have sons or not, whether the title passes to him or away from him. It will not be what he might have inherited, but it will be sufficient, and it will be unconditional." Sylvia looked at him for a long moment. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I am aware," he said. "I am doing it because Ned is Robert's son and because you have spent 4 years protecting him without asking anyone for anything, and because—" He stopped. He had arrived at the edge of the speech again, the place where the language became inadequate, and he had promised himself he would not make a speech. "Because it is right," he said, "and because I want to." She was quiet for long enough that he began to wonder if he had misjudged something. Then she said, "The man I thought you were when you arrived would not have done this." "No," Julian said, "he would not have." "What changed him?" Julian looked at her. 7 weeks in this sitting room," he said, "and a letter, and a 4-year-old who put a wooden horse on my knee and left it there." Something broke open in her face. Not the composure held as it always did, but something behind it, something she had been holding at a careful distance for some time, and which had now moved closer than that. She stood, she crossed to him. "Julian," she said quietly. "Sylvia," he said. She was standing very close. He looked at her with the expression that Ned had been identifying for weeks, the one he had stopped trying to conceal. "What happens now?" she said. "I had hoped," he said, "to ask you something." "Then ask it." He had not planned a speech and he did not make one. He looked at her directly, the way she had looked at him since the first morning, without performance, without cushion. "Marry me," he said. "Not for the settlement or for Ned's position or for any legal convenience, for—" He stopped. He thought of Robert's letter. "Stop performing." "I have been warm," he said, "in this room. That is not something I was before. I don't intend to go back to it." She held his gaze. "That is not a very romantic speech," she said. "I told you I would not make a speech." "You made half of one," she said. The corner of her mouth moved. "All right." He blinked. "That's all." "You said no speeches. I am taking that instruction seriously." She looked at him with the clear, steady expression he had learned to read past the composure to find. "You have been making speeches at me for 7 weeks, Julian. I think we have both had enough of your speeches." He looked at her for a moment. He was aware of his face doing the thing, and he was aware that she could see it, and for once he did not adjust it. He kissed her. Brief, definitive. Nothing like the performances he had observed at other people's engagements, just proximity and the end of a very long pretense, his hand at her jaw, her hand against his chest, where it had gone without either of them arranging it. She pulled back. She looked at him with the composed expression that was now doing entirely different work, holding something entirely different in check. Ned will come through that door, she said. He always knows when something has happened. How long do we have? She considered. 4 minutes. Then I have 4 minutes to say, Julian said, that I intend to be here, not at the inn here. Whatever form that takes while the arrangements are made, I am not going back to Carmore to wait. She tilted her head slightly. Mrs. Fairweather will be insufferable. Mrs. Fairweather, Julian said, has been right about everything since October. She has earned it. Sylvia laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh without restraint. A real laugh, brief and warm and entirely unguarded, and it did something to the room that the fire and the lamp had not managed. The door opened. Ned came through it, stopped, and assessed them both with 4-year-old precision. "Why is your face different?" he asked Julian. "It has been rearranged," Julian said. Ned absorbed this. He looked between them. "Are you staying now?" "Yes," Julian said. Ned considered. Then he went to the mantelpiece, collected Bramble and the rider both, crossed the room and placed them in Julian's hands. Not offering, not showing. Placing them there, the way one puts a thing where it belongs, with the certainty of someone whose arrangements have concluded exactly as he intended. He looked at Julian for a moment with Robert's eyes, pale brown, wide-set, entirely serious. "Good," he said, and went back to his blocks. Julian looked down at the 2 figures in his hands. The rough horse with the string tail, the small rider smoothed to fine grain, Robert's hands, imperfect and loving, his own hands, doing it better because he had had time to learn, and Robert had not. Sylvia sat beside him on the settee, beside him, not across from him, and looked at what he was holding. "He was waiting for you to stay," she said quietly. "I know," Julian said. "I should have stayed sooner." "You stayed when you were ready," she said. "That is the better thing." He looked at her. He thought about Carmore, the serious rooms, the closed gallery, the dining room that had not been warm in years. He thought about limewood and a penknife and 2 winter evenings, and about his father teaching him to read the grain, and about Robert who had never got the grain right and had not minded, and about a boy on a riverbank asking if something bad was going to happen. Nothing bad, he had said. He had been right. The matter of Forsyth resolved itself in the following fortnight, with the quiet efficiency of a legal argument that has run out of road. Price wrote. Forsyth's solicitor wrote back. There was a brief exchange that amounted in substance to a withdrawal. Price reported it without ceremony. Julian wrote to Carmore. He wrote to the housekeeper about the east wing. He wrote to the steward about the drainage and the eastern tenant and which rooms needed their shutters opened. He wrote a separate note about the stables, their condition, their capacity, whether the tack room could be extended. He wrote to his man of business in London about the settlement for Ned. He spent some time on this. He wanted it correct. He wanted it to be the kind of provision that required no goodwill to activate. That would hold whether Julian was alive or dead, whether Ned remained his heir or was displaced by sons, whether the family remained on good terms or not. He wanted Ned to have something that was simply his, unconditional, requiring nothing from anyone. He showed Sylvia the draft. She read it with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and suggested one amendment. It was an improvement. He sent it. "You might have simply asked me what I wanted from the outset," she said. "I didn't know at the outset that your opinion would be worth having," he said. She looked at him. "That is either an insult or a compliment." "It is a confession," he said. "There is a difference." She held his gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I suppose there is." They told Ned on a Sunday morning by the fire while he was engaged in a campaign against a pile of wooden blocks that had, apparently, required defeating. Sylvia explained it simply. Julian was going to be part of their family. He would live with them and they would live with him, and Bramble would have more places to stable. Ned listened with his head to one side. "Does that mean you're my father now?" he asked Julian. A pause. "Your father was your father," Julian said. "He will always be your father. I am your Uncle Julian." He held Ned's gaze. "But I am going to be here. For a long time." Ned processed this. He looked at Bramble, then at Julian, with the particular seriousness of someone making an assessment that matters. "You have the same hands," Ned said, looking at the carved rider in Julian's palm. "The ones that make things." "Yes," Julian said. "Papa said they'd bring you here." Julian was quiet for a moment. "He was right," he said. Ned nodded, satisfied, and returned to his blocks. Sylvia looked at Julian across the room. The expression on her face was entirely clear, and she let him see it, and he held it. And for a moment the room was very still. Then Ned knocked over a tower and the stillness ended, and the morning continued. They married in January, in the church at the end of Cloth Street, in a ceremony attended by Price and Mrs. Fairweather and Mrs. Hooper, and a respectable collection of Weybourne families who had been watching since October, and felt, collectively, that they had earned their place. The weather was cold and clear. The church was plain and warm. Ned stood beside Julian for the ceremony, a position he had assigned himself without consultation. He had Bramble in his coat pocket. Julian knew because he had checked that morning, under the guise of straightening Ned's collar, and found the small wooden horse already in place. Sylvia came down the aisle in a dress the colour of winter light, with the expression she wore for things that mattered, the composure that was her courage, fully deployed. When she reached Julian, she looked at his face the way she had since the first morning, the look of someone assessing a situation, and then something in it changed, and what replaced it was something Julian had been working towards since November, without knowing that was what he was doing. He offered her his hand. She took it. The ceremony was brief. Price cried discreetly. Mrs. Fairweather did not cry, but held herself with the bearing of someone who has been vindicated. Ned, at the critical moment, produced Bramble from his pocket and showed the horse the proceedings, apparently so that Bramble could serve as witness. Nobody commented on this. Julian, who was watching from the corner of his eye, felt something in his chest do the thing it had been doing since October, which he had given up trying to name. In February, a month after the wedding, Julian was at the writing desk by the window. His desk now moved from the corner where the light was poor, which Sylvia had permitted with the expression of someone who has chosen her battles and is choosing this one to let go. The Carmore correspondence was before him. The East Wing renovation had begun. The drainage project was underway. The eastern tenant had written a letter of such evident relief that Julian had read it twice. Ned was on the floor nearby, narrating an architectural project to Bramble, who was serving as foreman. The project's structural logic was unclear, but its ambition was considerable. Sylvia came in from some household matter and stopped in the doorway for a moment. She looked at the room, Julian at the desk, Ned on the floor, the fire well maintained, the stable on the mantelpiece with the rider beside it exactly where Ned had placed them. She went to the window, not watching for anything, just the light. The February light in Weybourne was thin and pale and came in low, nothing like the south-facing light at Carmore, which was stronger and more certain. She preferred this light. Julian looked up from his letter. He looked at her at the window and at Ned on the floor and at the stable on the mantelpiece, and then his eye went to the desk, and he noticed that Bramble was propped against his inkpot. Ned must have put him there earlier, while Julian was writing without interrupting. He had not moved the horse, he had written around him. He looked at Bramble. He looked at Sylvia at the window. He looked at the letter in his hand, which was to the East Wing contractor, and which contained the phrase, "The house is to be made comfortable," in terms that left no ambiguity. He dipped his pen and went back to the letter. Ned's narration continued. The architectural project progressed. Outside the window the February light held, thin and white and entirely specific to Weybourne, and Sylvia stood in it without moving, her face turned slightly toward the room, toward the sounds of it, toward the ordinary and particular fact of it. She did not say anything. She did not need to.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.